Paul McCartney is often described as the most gifted all-round musician in the Beatles. He could write melodies effortlessly, switch between bass, piano, guitar, and vocals, and still make it look easy. But even for Paul, not every Beatles song came naturally. Behind some of the band's most famous recordings were moments of hesitation, songs that demanded more technical control, emotional restraint, or sheer endurance than Paul expected. In rare moments, he even admitted that certain parts were slightly above his comfort level. These weren't failures. They were proof of how far the Beatles were pushing themselves. Here are 10 Beatles songs Paul McCartney struggled to play, starting with one that sounds simple, but absolutely isn't. Number 10, Blackbird in 1968. At first glance, Blackbird feels effortless, one voice, one acoustic guitar. No studio tricks, no band, but that simplicity is deceptive. Paul McCartney built Blackbird around a classical fingerpicking technique inspired by Johann Sebastian Bach, specifically the counterpoint style he practiced as a teenager. Unlike typical folk strumming, the song requires independent movement between the thumb and fingers, maintaining bass notes while playing a melodic line on top. Paul later admitted that Blackbird demanded full concentration every single time he played it. There was no room for error. Miss one note, and the entire illusion collapsed. Unlike many Beatles songs, Blackbird couldn't be powered through with emotion or volume. It required precision, calm, control. That's why, for years, Paul avoided playing it live regularly. Not because it wasn't good, but because it demanded a level of technical focus that left no margin for distraction. In many ways, Blackbird was Paul proving something to himself, that he could write something quiet, delicate, and technically unforgiving, and still make it sound effortless. But behind the scenes, it was one of the hardest things he ever played. Number 9, You Never Give Me Your Money, 1969. You Never Give Me Your Money is often praised as one of Paul McCartney's most emotionally layered compositions, but it was also one of the most demanding pieces he ever had to perform. The song isn't just one idea. It's several songs stitched together, a piano-led lament, a gentle folk passage, a sarcastic sing-along, and a dreamlike instrumental fade. Holding all of that together required Paul to constantly shift mood, touch, and vocal delivery, sometimes within the same verse. Paul later admitted that the piano part, while not flashy, was deceptively difficult. It had to sound loose and conversational, yet remain perfectly controlled. Too stiff, and the emotion vanished. Too free, and the structure fell apart. Playing it while singing added another layer of strain, especially during the more rhythmically fluid sections. There was also emotional weight. The lyrics reflected real frustration over the band's business chaos in 1969. Paul wasn't just playing notes, he was reliving tension, resentment, and disappointment every time he performed it. That's why You Never Give Me Your Money was rarely played live, not because Paul couldn't handle it, but because it demanded technical precision and emotional vulnerability at the same time. For Paul McCartney, this song wasn't above his talent, it was above his comfort zone. Number 8, Martha My Dear, 1968. Martha My Dear might sound light, elegant, and effortless, but for Paul McCartney, it was one of the most technically demanding songs he ever wrote for the Beatles. At its core, the song is driven almost entirely by piano. Not rock piano, not blues piano, but a classically influenced, constantly moving part that requires independence between the hands, precise timing, and absolute control of dynamics. Paul wasn't just accompanying himself. The piano was the song. McCartney later acknowledged that the piano writing came from his growing exposure to classical music. The problem was simple. He wasn't a trained classical pianist. Playing Martha My Dear meant navigating rapid chord changes, unexpected modulations, and rhythmic accents that leave no room for sloppiness, all while singing a melody that floats delicately above the arrangement. That's why Paul recorded most of the track alone. It wasn't about ego, it was about practicality. Coordinating this piece with a full band would have been nearly impossible, especially when the piano dictated every movement. The string and brass arrangements added elegance, but they also increased the pressure. Any mistake in the piano part would be painfully obvious. Martha, my dear, sounds playful and charming, but underneath it's a tightrope walk, one that pushed Paul right to the edge of his technical ability. Number 7, The Long and Winding Road, 1970. At first glance, The Long and Winding Road feels simple, a slow, emotional ballad built around melody rather than virtuosity. But for Paul McCartney, this song became one of the most deceptively difficult pieces he ever had to perform. The challenge wasn't speed or complexity, it was control. Paul wrote the song late in the Beatles' lifespan, at a moment when emotions were fragile and the band was barely holding together. The piano part is exposed, sparse, and unforgiving. There's nowhere to hide. Every chord must land with emotional weight. Every vocal phrase must sound restrained yet vulnerable. One wrong emphasis, and the song collapses into sentimentality. McCartney admitted that playing it live was exhausting, not physically but emotionally. The vocal range sits in an uncomfortable place, requiring constant breath control, especially during the long, sustained notes in the chorus. Sing too forcefully and it sounds overwrought. Sing too softly and it loses power. The studio version only added to the frustration. Phil Spector's orchestral overdubs buried the intimacy Paul had carefully balanced on the piano. When Paul heard the final mix, he felt the emotional precision he'd struggled to maintain had been lost. The Long and Winding Road proved something important. Difficulty isn't always about technique. Sometimes the hardest songs to play are the ones that demand perfect emotional discipline, every single time. Number 6, Golden Slumbers, 1969. Golden Slumbers is one of those Beatles songs that sounds effortless, almost childlike in its warmth and melody. But for Paul McCartney, it was anything but easy to play. The difficulty came from balance and restraint. Paul built Golden Slumbers around a piano part that needed to feel intimate and fragile, while also carrying the emotional weight of the entire Abbey Road medley. The chords are simple on paper, but the timing is delicate. Each change has to breathe naturally, because the song isn't driven by rhythm, it's driven by feeling. Vocally, the song pushed Paul into a tricky register. The melody sits high, demanding power without aggression. He had to sing with enough strength to feel reassuring, but not so much that it broke the lullaby-like atmosphere. That balance was hard to maintain, especially in live or semi-live takes. Paul later explained that Golden Slumbers was emotionally demanding because it felt like a goodbye, not just within the song, but to the Beatles themselves. That awareness made every performance heavier. One wrong push, and the song stopped sounding comforting and started sounding dramatic. Adding to the challenge, Golden Slumbers doesn't stand alone. It flows directly in to carry that weight, meaning Paul had no room to reset emotionally or musically. Once he started, he had to stay perfectly locked in. For McCartney, Golden Slumbers proved that simplicity can be the hardest thing to play convincingly. Number 5, For No One, 1966.
Your day breaks, your mind aches.
For No One is often praised as one of Paul McCartney's most emotionally precise songs, but it was also one of the most technically and psychologically difficult for him to perform. On the surface, the piano part sounds restrained and almost cold. That's exactly the problem. Paul wrote For No One during a deeply personal breakup, and the song required him to suppress emotion rather than release it. Unlike ballads where he could lean into melody and warmth, this song demanded emotional distance. The piano part had to stay clipped, controlled, and unsentimental, even while the lyrics described the death of a relationship in real time. Technically, the piano phrasing is deceptive. The left hand maintains a rigid, almost mechanical pulse, while the right hand moves delicately around the vocal. Any slight exaggeration, too much rubato, too much softness, ruins the emotional logic of the song. Paul later admitted that keeping the performance emotionally flat was harder than pouring his heart out. Vocally, the melody sits in an uncomfortable middle range. It isn't showy, but it's exposed. There's nowhere to hide. No harmonies from John or George, no guitar textures, no dramatic dynamics. Every breath is audible. Every crack feels fatal. The famous French horn solo added another layer of pressure. Paul had to leave just enough space for it to feel inevitable, not decorative. That required near-perfect timing. McCartney later reflected that for no one was difficult because it demanded emotional honesty without theatrical release, a level of control he found harder than virtuosity. Number 4. She's Leaving Home, 1967. She's Leaving Home was one of the most emotionally and structurally demanding songs Paul McCartney ever had to perform, not because of technical difficulty, but because of the discipline it required. Unlike most Beatles songs, there is no band on the track at all. No drums, no guitars, no safety net, just voices and strings. For Paul, that meant every flaw was exposed. His vocal had to carry narrative, emotion, and pacing without relying on groove or rhythmic drive. The melody itself is deceptively simple, but it sits awkwardly in Paul's range. It forces him to sing softly while sustaining long, fragile notes. Any excess vibrato would break the illusion. Any emotional push would tip the song into melodrama. Paul had to stay restrained, almost documentary-like, while telling a heartbreaking story about generational disconnect. What made it even harder was the storytelling responsibility. Paul wasn't singing about himself. He was singing as an observer, portraying a young woman leaving home and parents who can't understand why. That emotional distance was intentional, but difficult. Paul later said it was one of the first times he realized singing wasn't just performance, but acting. Adding to the pressure, the orchestral arrangement left no room for rhythmic error. Every entrance had to align perfectly with the strings. George Martin's score was unforgiving. Miss a cue, and the entire emotional arc collapses. Paul also had to balance against John Lennon's counterpoint vocal, calm, almost indifferent, which required Paul to stay grounded and controlled, never overpowering the narrative. McCartney later admitted that She's Leaving Home was hard because it demanded precision without passion, emotion without indulgence. It was one of the first times he had to suppress his natural musical instincts to serve the song. Number 3, Penny Lane, 1967. Penny Lane is often remembered as one of Paul McCartney's most joyful, effortless creations. Bright brass, vivid imagery, and a sing-along chorus that feels timeless. But behind that polished surface, it was one of the songs Paul struggled with the most, especially when it came to performing and reproducing it accurately. The difficulty wasn't emotional, it was architectural. Unlike many Beatles songs built around guitars or a live band feel, Penny Lane is a studio construction piece. Piano, layered harmonies, piccolo trumpet, bass lines moving independently from the melody. Every element is doing something different at the same time. Paul wasn't just singing, he was navigating traffic. Vocally, the melody jumps constantly between registers. Paul has to move from conversational verses into a chorus that climbs higher and higher, all while staying light and cheerful. Push too hard, and it sounds strained. Hold back too much, and the song loses its sparkle. McCartney later admitted that maintaining that balance live was exhausting. The bass line added another layer of difficulty. Unlike traditional root note bass parts, Penny Lane features a melodic, counter-running bass that moves almost like a second vocal. Playing that bass line while singing a completely different melody demanded extreme coordination. Paul once joked that it felt like patting your head, rubbing your stomach, and telling a story at the same time. Then there was the arrangement problem. The famous piccolo trumpet solo, inspired by Bach, could never be replicated organically in a rock setting. That meant Penny Lane quickly became a song that existed best on record, not on stage. Paul knew that, and it bothered him. He later admitted that Penny Lane was the moment he realized studio perfection could become a performance trap. The song sounded effortless, but only because of countless takes, edits, and precision decisions. To listeners, it feels like nostalgia wrapped in sunshine. To Paul McCartney, it was one of the first songs that showed him how high his own standards had become, and how difficult it was to live up to them. Number 2, Let It Be, 1970. Let It Be is often described as Paul McCartney's spiritual anchor, a song of calm, acceptance, and quiet wisdom. To the world, it sounds simple, almost effortless. A hymn disguised as a pop song. But for Paul himself, Let It Be was far more difficult to play and live with than it ever appeared. The struggle began with the piano part. Unlike Paul's more rhythmic rock piano style, Let It Be requires restraint. Every chord has to breathe. Push too hard and it becomes gospel heavy. Play too softly and it loses gravity. McCartney later admitted that keeping the song emotionally grounded, especially live, was harder than playing something technically flashy. Vocally, the challenge was even greater. Let It Be sits in a delicate emotional register. Paul isn't shouting, pleading, or soaring, he's holding back. That restraint requires enormous control. Any crack in the voice changes the song's meaning. Paul once said that singing it live felt like walking a tightrope between comfort and collapse. Then came the real complication. Versions. There isn't just one Let It Be. There are multiple guitar solos, multiple mixes, multiple emotional intentions. Paul preferred the gentler album version. Phil Spector favored the grand orchestral approach. George Harrison delivered two very different solos. Each version pulled the song in a different emotional direction, and Paul had to adapt to all of them. Live, the song became a burden. Audiences expected transcendence every single time. They weren't listening anymore, they were judging. Paul later admitted that Let It Be became one of the most emotionally draining songs to perform because people didn't want a performance. They wanted reassurance. Ironically, the song about surrender required absolute control to play correctly. McCartney once reflected that Let It Be sat just above my level, not because of technique, but because of responsibility. It carried too much weight, personal, cultural, and historical. To listeners, it's peace. To Paul McCartney, Let It Be was a reminder that the simplest songs can be the hardest to carry. Number 1, Hey Jude, 1968. If Let It Be was emotionally demanding, Hey Jude was emotionally exhausting. On paper, Hey Jude doesn't look difficult. Slow tempo, simple chord progression, a melody that feels conversational. But Paul McCartney has repeatedly admitted that this song sat far above his comfort level, not because of technique, but because of endurance, pressure, and expectation. The first challenge was length. At over 7 minutes, Hey Jude defied every pop rule of its era. For Paul, performing it meant sustaining focus, pitch, and emotional intensity far longer than most Beatles songs required. The opening verses demand tenderness and intimacy. Then, halfway through, the song explodes into one of the longest and most famous codas in rock history. That coda, na 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 na, became the real obstacle. Live, it wasn't just singing, it was leading thousands of people. Paul had to cue the crowd, hold the tempo, manage dynamics, and keep the energy alive without rushing or dragging. One misjudged pace, and the entire ending could collapse into chaos. McCartney later admitted that keeping the coda controlled while still sounding spontaneous was one of the hardest things I ever had to do on stage. There was also the emotional weight. Written to comfort John Lennon's son during his parents' breakup, Hey Jude carries a deeply personal core. Singing it meant reopening that feeling, while knowing the song had become something much bigger than its origin. Paul later described Hey Jude as slightly above my level because it demanded everything at once: control, stamina, leadership, and emotional honesty. To the audience, it feels effortless. To McCartney, it's a marathon disguised as a lullaby. That's why Hey Jude stands at number 1, not as his hardest song to write, but as the one he had to work the hardest to survive.